Welcome to the Gary DeMar Blogcast, presented by the American Vision and Canon Press. For more from Gary, check out the American Vision collection on the Canon app.
This is Gary DeMar and my blogcast. I'm going to be dealing with, this is the part 2 of my critique of John MacArthur and comments that he made in an interview regarding the last days. And he mentions how when he was in the former Soviet Union speaking to 1,600 pastors, they asked him to talk on the last days. And I mentioned that how he started this. He said the following: it's going to be the rapture of the church. That's an unsigned event. In other words, there are no signs that are preliminary to that event. It's going to be suddenly, in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, snatching out the church. And that's the position. So everything you see today and hear today regarding eschatology, and people say, well, all the signs are in place for Jesus' return. According to the dispensational system, that can't not be. There cannot be any signs related to the rapture. It's a secret event, timeless in terms of its signs, and it could have happened in any time during history. Now, selling books about Bible prophecy would nosedive if they really believed that and taught that, but that is the position, because people are always looking for signs. They say, oh, how can you say that Jesus isn't going to be coming back soon? Look at all the signs that we see around us. Well, according to the dispensational system, there aren't any signs. Even Israel becoming a nation again. And I remember debating a prominent dispensationalist on this in a radio interview, and he actually said that what's going to have to happen, because this is a signless event, what's going to have to happen is that Israel is going to have to be kicked out of the land again and be brought back into the land. Because Israel in the land right now can't be a sign, because there are no signs preceding the rapture. John MacArthur says this, and every other dispensationalist says it, but those who write books on it don't seem to mention that idea. Then there's the claim that there's going to be a 7-year tribulation period. And that 7-year tribulation period is not found in the book of Revelation. A lot of people are surprised by this. Supposedly, from chapters 4 through 19 is about the 7-year tribulation period. And the odd thing is, if this is about a 7-year period, the phrase 7 years doesn't appear anywhere in the book of Revelation. Now, 3.5 years appears, but 3.5 years appears 5 different times. And so do you add the 5 different times together? Which 2 do you take to be the 7 years? It's very, very confusing. So if this is supposed to be a 7-year period and the book of Revelation is supposed to be about that 7-year period, why is it that we don't find 7 years mentioned in the book of Revelation? Now, remember what John MacArthur said in part 1 of this 2-part series. John MacArthur said that God is very precise. If there's supposed to be a 7-year period in Revelation chapters 4 through 19 is supposed to be about that 7-year period, why don't we find the precision of a 7-year period mentioned during that time period? Now, what John MacArthur goes on to say is this: Daniel refers to that period, and that period is laid out in the book of Revelation repeatedly. Even the numbers are laid out in from Revelation. He said Revelation chapter 6 through 19. It's Revelation chapters 4 through 19. And he goes on to say, I went through all that, and I said that's going to be followed by the return of Jesus Christ to establish his 1,000-year kingdom. Okay, so where does this 7 years come from? It's interesting. He doesn't say it comes from the book of Revelation. He says it comes from the book of Daniel. Well, where in the book of Daniel? Well, supposedly Daniel chapter 9, verses 24 through 27. This is Daniel's 70 weeks of years, which we agree, John MacArthur and I and most others agree, that the 70 weeks of years is 490 years. The problem is that the dispensationalists, and this would include John MacArthur, believes that the 70th year is broken off from the other 69 years. And so what you have is 483 years, and then a gap of nearly 2,000 years so far, and then there will be 7 years that will appear, and that will finish off the 70 weeks. The text doesn't say that anywhere. Now, it doesn't say that there's a gap between the 69th week and the 70th week. One has to impose that on the text. Now, we have to remember when you read Daniel chapter 9 is reading the book of Jeremiah. In the book of Jeremiah, it talks about the 70 years that Israel was into captivity, and they were coming up on the end of that 70 years of captivity. So the number 70 is already used in Revelation chapter 9. Now, was there a gap in the 70 years that they were off into captivity? No, there was 70 years. And Daniel, in reading the prophets, saw that we were coming to an end of all this. And so if there's no gap in the 70 years of captivity, why all of a sudden would there be a gap in the final 70th week of 70 years and the 70 weeks of years? Again, we're dealing here with the lack of precision. God was very precise in saying how long the captivity was going to be. Why wouldn't he be precise when he uses the same number in determining when the 70 weeks of years is all going to take place? So again, we don't find the church mentioned. I need to get back to this. What we find here, we don't find the 7 years of tribulation mentioned in the book of Revelation. 7 years isn't used. And we don't find a gap between the 69th and the 70th week of years of Daniel's prophecy. And so the precision, once again, is thrown out the window. And when you have numerous doctrines that don't have specific texts to make your case, you better go back and assess your position. Now, then John MacArthur goes on and he says that the events are laid out from Revelation, again, not Revelation 6, but Revelation 4 through 19. And he says that what you find here is that the church is missing. Supposedly in chapters 1, 2, 3, you find that the church is mentioned, and all of a sudden the church disappears. At beginning with chapter 4, where John is taken up into heaven. It doesn't say the church is taken up into heaven. It says that John is taken up into heaven. And so in chapters 4 through 19, the church is supposedly missing, and what we have God dealing with here is Israel once again, that supposedly this is Daniel's 70th week. This is Daniel's seven years. Again, there's no mention of seven years. There's no mention of a gap. So let's take a look at the argument about the idea that in the first 3 chapters of the book of Revelation, that the word church is used 19 times, and all of a sudden it disappears in chapters 4 through 19. And let's evaluate that in terms of the claim that means that disappearance is the rapture of the church. I'm reading from my book, The Rapture and the Fig Tree Generation. It says the first 3 chapters of Revelation deal with 7 first-century historical churches, assemblies of believers in Asia Minor, the church in Ephesus, the church in Smyrna, the church in Pergamon, the church in Thyatira, the church in Sardis, the church in Philadelphia, and the church in Laodicea. These are 7 specific historical churches that existed at that particular period of time. The church in Philadelphia and the church in Laodicea. There is no mention of the church as a universal entity in Revelation chapters 1 through 3. You don't find the phrase the corporate church or the church. It's the church in these various locales. If Jesus meant the universal church at a time just before the so-called rapture, he could have or he would have used a phrase like the whole church, like he does in Romans chapter 16:23. Instead, Jesus refers to actual congregations in a limited geographical area in that first century. We know this is true because there were other local churches in the Roman Empire, the church in Rome, all the churches of the Gentiles, the church that met in the house of Aquila and Prisca, all the churches, Corinth, Galatia, the churches of Galatia in Galatians chapter 1, verse 2, Philippi, Colossae, and Jerusalem, Acts chapter 5, verse 11, and Acts 8:1. So there were all kinds of churches throughout that area at that particular period of time. But the book of Revelation is not dealing with the corporate church, the church around the world throughout all time. It's dealing with those particular churches. So if the number of times a word appears is important, and Revelation chapters 4 through 19 is said to be about Israel. Now remember, first 3 chapters is supposed to be about the church, even though the word church does not appear as a corporate entity in those 3 chapters. And then chapters 4 through 19 is supposed to be about Israel. So if the number of times a word appears is important, and Revelation 4 through 19 is said to be about Israel, why does the word Israel only appear once after the supposed rapture of the church, and not until Revelation chapter 7, verse 4? One would think that if the corporate church is in view in the first 3 chapters because the words church and churches are used 19 times, but never used in terms of the corporate church, then shouldn't we expect to find the word Israel used more than once after chapter 3 if this entire 7-year period, again, no mention of 7 years in this period, is about Israel? The word Israel does appear in Revelation chapter 21, verse 12, but the word churches appears in Revelation 22:16. So word count exegesis is not what we're all about. So what John MacArthur is teaching is standard dispensational doctrine. And that doctrine has numerous problems. One is there is no verse in the Bible that says the church is going to be taken off the earth either before, during, or after a 7-year period. The Revelation chapters 1 through 3 does not mention the corporate church. Revelations 4 through 19, there's no indication here that the church was taken off the earth. It just makes absolutely no sense. And the fact that there are no signs leading up to the so-called rapture of the church it's built on a foundation of sand. For example, there's no verse that says that there's going to be a covenant made between the Antichrist and Israel. There's nothing that says that that covenant is going to be broken. We already mentioned there's no gap between the 69th and the 70th weeks of Daniel chapter 9. There's no mention of a temple being rebuilt. The New Testament doesn't say anything about Israel becoming a nation again and being put back into their land. The dispensational system is filled with conjecture, one conjecture built upon another. And when you get right down to it, the position cannot stand the precision that God requires concerning Bible prophecy.
If you enjoyed this week's episode, listen to the End Times Radio Debate with Gary DeMar and Dr. Robert Thomas. Listen now in the Canon app.